So I just watched Elemental and I actually thought it was good, and that is something nice to be expected considering I've addressed my worriedness of Disney's promotion of the film being bland and generic of something we've already seen. Where don't get me wrong, most of the film still has their moments that I've had issues with before, but the film itself is still way better than what you've expected from the trailers and the other content that have come out before its release. I mean, the film itself is not up to the standards of Pixar of old, far from it, but it certainly isn't the worst thing they have produced, and more of in the middle ranking of Pixar films. More generic, but still good overall, which is actually a pretty high bar for the studio considering their worst films are not completely trash, even like Cars 2 or even The Good Dinosaur, which of course was the film that Peter Sohn directed before this, where I'm very happy to say that he has improved a lot in this one with the beautiful animation. I mean, the worst thing about all of this was the fact of its release alongside other films like The Flash in the most crowded summer ever, which I don't understand at all. It's a similar problem that Disney has had made for the past films that they have released, not giving the time it needs to be in the spotlight to make the money they want, where I really don't understand those decisions. This is something that needs to change, where it feels like not even Disney believed in this film either, like most of the public has. They just throw it out of the limelight just to make money on the things that matter the most to them. So without spoilers, the whole entire plot of the film revolves around what we already know in the trailers of the background of different elements and the immigrant experience, with a romantic comedy between the main characters portrayed as elements, which I actually didn't have a problem with and actually was the highlight of the film itself. Because in my past videos, I have mentioned that the problem I was having with these types of stories was not really taking the element idea really well with how they do things like they can't mix, which they actually can, and how some of the characters like air is portrayed as clouds when clouds are actually particles in air. But watching the film itself, I really get exactly what they needed out of the environments they actually have in it. And the real thing that actually stood out with me was the design of Element City itself, something I've actually taken a liking to before with the trailers that have come out in the clips, and really loved with what they did to represent different neighborhoods, which was all primarily based on New York City itself and the director's youth in that city. And the most enjoyable aspect that many people will appreciate about this film is the fact of the score being done by Thomas Newman, who has made the most emotional scores for Pixar like in Finding Nemo and WALL-E, and has certainly still the flair here, especially in those scenes where Wade and Ember hang out together and do stuff around the city. It just makes you stop and think about other things and fall in love with the visuals in the moment that is being introduced, and I really like that, where it's more similar to how WALL-E was, considering it is a love story similar in that vein with two non-human characters that look completely different who share a unique bond. Of course, WALL-E being the superior film, but this one still stands out great on its own. In some ways, I kind of understand why the budget for this movie was big with the different animation choice they presented to us, which I think is very stunning, where you might have noticed others actually put this fact down considering it lacks from before, but I actually think it is beautiful, like the music itself. I mean, it certainly is not as stunning or as amazing as the Spider-Verse, where every frame is a work of art in that very film and the best film of the entire year, but I actually appreciate what they're trying to do with the elements, specifically more so than other Pixar films have done before this, and that is something that at the very least makes this movie stand out more from Disney, where for the most part of what I've addressed for the past few years have showed the studio of Pixar and Walt Disney Animation blending in with each other, not being very different in styles, which is still a very big problem at this point and have to face by fixing it going back to 2D, because otherwise I really don't think Pixar is going to achieve the heights they used to have with the way things are actually going in these stories and actually future films like Elio. And yeah, there are problems like before the film came out that have actually appeared in the film itself by focusing on these weird elements, no pun intended, which aren't particularly important to the overall story itself, and really ties in back to how I thought the story could have been better served in this different direction by having the communities work together to actually form the elements we know of, which the film actually lacks in those other eras that they actually wanted to explore, because the focus is more on the love story of the main characters rather than what they could have done with the elemental message of the movie itself, and that still is extremely disappointing on its own. But by no means does that actually make it a bad story, because it certainly isn't. It's just not like the greats they have been used to producing during their golden age, but certainly better story-wise than what I've seen recently in their sequels, where they do make the most money for the studio, but beyond that never really have anything to show for in story-wise, where at least this has something to show for as well, which is something I have said for the other previous films too, like Turning Red and Luca, where this is a fact that still remains that Disney should have at the very least promoted it for theaters instead of releasing it for Disney+, a mistake that is still remaining for this film because of the failure of Lightyear and the promotion they did right here that never convinced many in the public that this was going to be the one to watch in theaters, and they have only themselves to blame for that, and as a result, the box office numbers for this film will be overall disappointing. Because clearly, this is a film superior to Lightyear in my opinion, or if they hadn't actually released that in theaters and maybe put a Turning Red or even Elemental if they actually made this film a year earlier, then I really think Pixar would be in a much better shape at this point in time, where this is the type of film that families would actually love to go for compared to the generic slop that slapped an IP onto its name that virtually had nowhere to go where in the very end. Because this is a film for the most case that still remains to be generic and predictable by the main story beats, but still has a lot of fun to be offered compared to before, where for the most part, which I really couldn't say for the others, where that actually also puts this onto a higher level than expected, where looking back on it, most people like myself actually went into this film a little bit overly pessimistic about it because Disney actually doesn't know properly how to market things anymore, because when you actually watch something like this, you really cannot fault the animation when you see it and the interesting takes that they are trying to perform themselves, which is actually what I really want. I really want these original stories like Elemental. I really don't want to hate them either, but this company just has given me too many reasons to not trust them anymore by their pathetic decisions on all levels of the company, and that is a stain that will still remain despite me enjoying something like this and something that still needs to be fixed. But another thing to add that I really didn't get into in the film itself was the comedy for the most part. I mean, I did enjoy some of it, but there are various elements that are not going to succeed and float past your mind just like the elements itself that I mentioned earlier. But it's something I really think for most people will not hamper your experience overall, but something that I felt needed to be toned down for focusing on the path that needed to be explored the most. And also lastly, another thing to add was the fact that the Upshort aired before it, which is something that I also miss from these Pixar films, as I haven't seen them in theaters for a long time since Bao aired before The Incredibles 2, where I've made my feelings clear that I think it's one of their best shorts, even better than Incredibles 2 itself, where this one, while not quite as great, was also a good starting experience to send us off on the characters of Up one last time. Not really doing much because it never needed a sequel or any of that, but a nice short to see Carl one last time, where Ed Asner had sadly passed away at this point and kind of officially closes the book on that universe and great film, and I appreciate what they did with this to return back to that style. So all in all, Elemental is a good experience that still has charm to it when it focuses on what it wants with a family and love story, but still doesn't have that spice to make it the Pixar we originally fell in love with in our youth in that very golden age. I still have issues with the film that I've previously presented, but overall still enjoyed it for what it was. And for those who are worried about it, I actually encourage you to watch it in theaters because it truly isn't a bad film at all, and something that is worth families for going to, and something that Disney needs to understand if they want to produce these original stories for the future instead of making sequels for the sake of trying to continue their profits. And with that said, that's all I have to add. I'm all done, so goodbye.